Welcome to another new story. In the waning days of summer, 1895, the Georgia State Archives, that solemn keeper of the state's collective memory, hummed with quiet, focused industry. The air hung thick with the scent of old paper and dust motes that drifted like tiny ghosts through shafts of sunlight piercing the high windows. There, Henry Vance, a clerk of painstaking habits and a near-reverent love for the written word, was deep inside the monumental task of reorganizing the state's earliest census records. It was tedious work, often maddeningly dull. But Vance threw himself into it with the devotion of an archaeologist brushing dust off ancient ruins, convinced that every crumbling scrap of paper cradled a story. Then, amid the brittle pages of the 1855 census returns for Muskogee County, his practiced eye caught something that made no sense. A name, penned in the looping, elegant script of the era, Samuel Rich. His age, 7 years old. Vance, a man who lived for cross-referencing, pulled the 1860 census for the same county, a document he'd recently catalogued. He searched for Samuel Rich. Nothing. He checked the 1870 census. Still no Samuel Rich. A minor clerical error, perhaps. A child who'd died. A family that had moved. Such discrepancies weren't unheard of. But something about this absence gnawed at Vance's professional soul. He checked birth records, church registries, even property deeds tied to the Rich family. And what he uncovered, piece by agonizing piece, wasn't a simple mistake. It was an impossibility. According to every other official document, including the family's own painstakingly kept Bible, the Rich's youngest son, Samuel, had been born in star 1860 star. He appeared in the 1860 census as an infant, and in later records, his age marched forward naturally. Yet here, in the 1855 census, stood a Samuel Rich, age 7, 5 full years before the documented birth of the family's Samuel. The discovery landed like a cold, unsettling whisper in the silent archives. A child had appeared in the official record before he was even born. This wasn't a ghost story in the usual sense. No spectral apparitions or creaking floorboards. It was something stranger, more chilling, an anomaly in the very fabric of recorded history. It hinted at a deliberate act, a carefully built deception so profound that it took 4 decades and 1 accidental clerk's diligence to bring it into the light. What kind of secret would drive a family to invent a child in official records, only to erase him, and then replace him with another 5 years later? That question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, promising a story far darker than anything Vance had encountered in all his years among dusty ledgers. Before we dig deeper into the unsettling truth behind the Rich family's impossible child, if this glimpse into a forgotten past has stirred something in you, please consider subscribing to the Liturgy of Fear. Your support helps us unearth more of these chilling historical enigmas. And tell us in the comments, what forgotten corner of history do you believe holds the most disturbing secrets? Muskogee County, Georgia, in the mid-1850s was a land still finding its footing. A place where the raw ambition of the frontier collided with the polished gentility of the Old South. Its red clay earth, baked hard by a relentless summer sun, then softened by winter rains, yielded cotton and corn in abundance, fueling the prosperity of those who owned its fertile acres. The air, especially in those humid months, carried the heavy perfume of magnolia and honeysuckle, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil and the distant, acrid tang of wood smoke. Life moved at a deliberate pace, dictated by the seasons and the rhythms of agricultural labor. The rich family, having migrated from the more established plantations of South Carolina in 1840, had quickly carved out their place in this burgeoning society. Their plantation, Willow Creek, sprawled across 200 acres, a respectable holding that allowed Thomas Hartwell Rich to cultivate not just crops but his reputation. Thomas, then in his mid-40s, was a man of formidable presence. Tall, with a stern face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had an almost obsessive need for order and control, meticulously documenting every bushel of cotton, every head of livestock, every penny spent or earned. His ledgers were immaculate. His accounts balanced to the last cent. He served on the county commission, attended First Baptist Church with unerring regularity, and was known for his unyielding propriety. To the outside world, Thomas Rich was the respectable Southern gentleman. His wife, Margaret, 20 years his junior, came from a prominent Charleston family. Their marriage was less a union of hearts than a strategic alliance, designed to consolidate wealth and social standing. Margaret was delicate, prone to nervous ailments, but she carried herself with the quiet dignity expected of a plantation mistress. She ran the household with efficiency, oversaw the enslaved domestic staff, and cultivated a small, fragrant rose garden, her one indulgence. Together they had 3 children, all healthy and well-adjusted by all accounts. William, born 1842, a sturdy boy destined to inherit his father's lands. Catherine, 1845, a spirited girl with a quick wit, and James, 1848, quieter, more studious. Their births were recorded in the family Bible, their baptisms noted in the church registry, their names carefully entered in the 1850 federal census. They were the legitimate fruits of a legitimate marriage, proof of the rich family's prosperity and adherence to society's rules. The plantation itself was a world unto itself. The main house, 2 stories with a wide veranda, stood beneath ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, their branches sighing in the breeze. Beyond the manicured lawns, the cotton fields stretched to the horizon, and further still, the cluster of cabins housing the enslaved. The sounds of Willow Creek were a constant symphony, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the rhythmic thud of hoes in the fields, the lowing of cattle, the hushed voices of enslaved people going about their daily tasks. The smells were equally everywhere, wood smoke from the kitchen, the sweet decay of ripening fruit, the sharp scent of pine resin, and in summer, the heavy, cloying perfume of jasmine. In this carefully constructed world of order and appearance, the unexpected was a threat. Deviation from the norm was anathema. Thomas Rich understood that respectability wasn't something you were, it was a performance, meticulously staged and rigorously maintained. Any crack in the facade, any hint of scandal or imperfection, could unravel years of careful cultivation. And it was this profound understanding of social vulnerability that would drive Thomas Rich to make a decision that would haunt his family for generations, and leave an indelible, impossible mark on history. In the late autumn of 1854, Margaret Rich announced her fourth pregnancy. The news was met with quiet satisfaction. Another heir for Willow Creek. Another testament to the family's vitality. But this pregnancy was different. From its earliest weeks, Margaret was plagued by an unusual lethargy, a persistent nausea that lingered far beyond the first trimester. Her delicate constitution seemed to buckle under the strain. She spent long days confined to her bed, curtains drawn against the bright Georgia sun, her appetite gone, her spirits low. The family physician, Dr. Elias Thorne, a man whose medical knowledge was a patchwork of folk remedies and rudimentary science, could offer little beyond tonics and assurances that such difficulties were sometimes a woman's lot. As the months wore on, Margaret worsened. She suffered persistent fevers, her body racked by tremors, her sleep disturbed by vivid, unsettling dreams. The enslaved women who attended her, especially an older woman named Hattie, her hands gnarled from years of labor but her touch surprisingly gentle, whispered among themselves. They spoke of bad humors and unlucky stars. Their quiet observations stood in stark contrast to Dr. Thorne's more optimistic, if ultimately useless, pronouncements. The air in Margaret's sickroom grew heavy with camphor and lavender, a futile attempt to mask the underlying malaise. The birth, when it finally came in the spring of 1855, was long and agonizing. It lasted 2 days and a night. A harrowing ordeal that left Margaret weak and delirious, her screams echoing faintly through the thick walls of the plantation house. Thomas Rich, usually a man of unflappable composure, paced the veranda, his face a mask of grim concern. The sounds from inside tormented his carefully maintained equilibrium. He had expected another healthy child. Another perfect addition to his lineage. What he got instead was a profound shock. The infant, a boy, was born alive but profoundly malformed. The exact nature of his deformities was never explicitly recorded in any surviving document, a testament to how immediately and thoroughly his existence was suppressed. But the actions that followed made the truth clear. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles. His small body contorted. His features, though recognizably human, were distorted in ways that defied easy description. He couldn't cry out with the robust vigor of a healthy newborn. Instead, he emitted a weak, reedy sound, more a whimper than a cry. Dr. Thorne, his face etched with pity and professional helplessness, delivered the news to Thomas Rich in a hushed, grave voice. He spoke in euphemisms, a child of God's mysterious design, a burden to be borne. But Thomas Rich understood the unspoken truth. This child was a profound imperfection. A visible flaw in the carefully constructed edifice of his family's respectability. The shame would be immense. The whispers relentless. In the rigid social hierarchy of the antebellum South, a visibly disabled child, especially one born into a prominent family, wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a public embarrassment. A stain on the family name that could affect the marriage prospects of his other children, the family's standing in the community, even the value of his property. In that moment, standing in the hushed, candlelit birthing room, the faint, unsettling cries of the infant echoing in his ears, Thomas Rich made a decision. A decision born of fear, of pride, and of a chillingly pragmatic calculation of his family's social survival. This child, he decided, would not exist. Not in any official sense. Not in any record that could be verified. Not in any way that would bring shame upon the Rich name or invite the scrutiny of neighbors and relatives. The child was born, yes. But his existence would be a secret. Carefully guarded. Meticulously erased from public view. The infant was given a name, Samuel *, a quiet act of acknowledgement performed by Margaret in her delirium. A name that would later be twisted into a tool of deception. He was baptized in secret, a hushed ceremony performed by a sympathetic, or perhaps intimidated, minister who asked no questions, his face impassive as he sprinkled holy water on the tiny, twisted form. The minister, Reverend Elijah Stone, understood the delicate balance of power in a plantation community and the unspoken requests of its patriarchs. He performed his duty, offered a brief, somber prayer, and departed, carrying the secret with him. The real Samuel Rich, the child of flesh and blood, would never appear in a census. Never be recorded in a birth registry. Never be acknowledged by his father in any official capacity. His existence was to be a void. A carefully managed absence. Instead, Thomas Rich embarked on an extraordinary act of deception. The 1855 federal census was due to be enumerated that summer. The census taker for Muskogee County was a man named Josiah Crane, a distant cousin of the Rich family, known more for his amiable disposition than his attention to detail. Crane was a frequent visitor to Willow Creek, often sharing a glass of iced tea on the veranda with Thomas Rich, discussing crop yields and local politics. He knew his place and understood the unspoken rules of deference to those of higher standing. When Josiah Crane arrived at Willow Creek in late July of 1855, his ledger and quill in hand, the Georgia sun beating down relentlessly, Thomas Rich greeted him with his customary, if somewhat strained, cordiality. They sat in the cool shade of the veranda, sipping lemonade, while Crane dutifully recorded the household's details. Thomas listed his wife Margaret and their 3 older children, William, Catherine, and James, their ages given precisely. Then, with a casualness that belied the monumental lie he was about to utter, Thomas Rich added another name. Samuel Rich, age 7. Josiah Crane, perhaps distracted by the heat, or the pleasant conversation, or simply his ingrained respect for Thomas Rich, made no comment. He recorded the information as given, his quill scratching across the page. The phantom Samuel Rich, the child who existed only on paper, was born in the official record. 7 years old. 5 years before the real Samuel Rich had drawn his first struggling breath. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Its execution chillingly simple. The creation of this phantom child served multiple purposes. It allowed Thomas Rich to maintain the appearance of a complete, healthy family unit in the official record, deflecting any potential questions about a missing child. It also created a convenient fiction, a placeholder for the child who, in Thomas Rich's mind, should have been born healthy and robust. The phantom Samuel aged in the records, a silent testament to a life that never was, while the real Samuel grew in secret, hidden away, his existence a carefully guarded secret. The psychological burden of maintaining this fiction must have been immense, especially for Margaret. A woman of delicate sensibilities, the constant presence of her hidden, deformed child, coupled with the public lie, must have weighed heavily on her fragile mind. She rarely spoke of Samuel, even to Hattie, the enslaved woman who was his primary caregiver. Her days were filled with a quiet melancholy, her nights often disturbed by restless sleep. The scent of her rose garden, once a source of solace, now seemed to mock her with its perfect beauty, a stark contrast to the imperfection she harbored within her own home. For 5 years, this deception held. The phantom Samuel Rich aged in the records, a ghost in the machine of bureaucracy, while the real Samuel Rich grew in secret, hidden in a small, windowless room in the back wing of the plantation house. He was cared for by enslaved women, primarily Hattie and her daughter Clara, who were bound by fear and circumstance to keep the secret. Their lives, already circumscribed by the brutal realities of slavery, were now further burdened by this profound, unspoken trust. They moved through the house with quiet efficiency, their faces impassive, their eyes betraying nothing of the hidden life they nurtured. Then came 1860. The census again. Thomas Rich faced a choice. The phantom Samuel Rich would now be listed as 12 years old. The real Samuel Rich was 5. To continue the deception, Thomas would have to maintain the fiction indefinitely, aging the phantom child year after year, creating an increasingly elaborate web of lies that would become harder and harder to sustain. Or he could simply let the phantom child disappear from the records, remove him from the 1860 census and create a new narrative. He chose the latter. When the census taker arrived at Willow Creek in 1860, Thomas Rich listed his family as before: Margaret, William, Catherine, and James. But Samuel Rich, the phantom child, was gone. He had vanished from official records as mysteriously as he had appeared in 1855. The real Samuel Rich remained hidden. But now he was truly invisible, not even a phantom in the documents, but a complete absence. A void where a person should have been. The lie had served its purpose, and now it was discarded, leaving behind only a faint, almost imperceptible ripple in the vast ocean of historical data. The secret might have died with Thomas Rich, who passed away in 1878, his face still stern, his ledgers still immaculate, if not for the accident of document reorganization in 1895 and the curiosity of a clerk named Henry Vance, who noticed something that no one else had thought to look for: a child who appeared in the records before he was born. The story of Samuel Rich, the phantom child, is a chilling testament to the lengths some will go to preserve appearances. It makes you wonder, What other truths lie buried beneath the surface of official histories? If you find yourself drawn to these hidden narratives, these whispers from the past, consider joining our community. Subscribe to the Liturgy of Fear, and let's continue exploring the dark corners of history together. The room where Samuel Rich spent his hidden life was not a dungeon, not a cell designed for punishment, but a small, windowless chamber in the furthest, least used wing of the Willow Creek plantation house. It had once been a storage room, perhaps for linens or out-of-season clothing, but Thomas Rich had repurposed it with chilling efficiency. The single narrow window that overlooked the dense woods at the edge of the property had been boarded up from the inside, thick planks of pine nailed securely across it, sealing out the light and the world beyond. The air inside was perpetually stale, heavy with the scent of old wood, dust, and the faint, lingering odor of human confinement. The room was sparsely furnished, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a chamber pot, and a small, rough-hewn table holding a single, perpetually burning candle. Its flickering flame was the only source of light in the perpetual gloom. The walls, once plastered and painted a pale cream, were now discolored by damp and time, streaked with dark stains that resembled weeping shadows. The only sounds that penetrated those thick walls were the distant, muffled echoes of plantation life, a rooster crowing, a dog barking, the faint murmur of voices. Sounds that must have seemed impossibly far away, like echoes from another world. Samuel's daily existence was a monotonous cycle of feeding, cleaning, and quiet endurance. He was fed a simple diet of gruel and broth, administered by Hattie or Clara, their faces impassive, their movements efficient. They spoke to him in hushed tones, if at all, their words few and functional. There was no affection, no comfort, no gentle touch beyond the necessary. They were caregivers, yes, but also silent jailers, bound by the unspoken thread of Thomas Rich's wrath. The texture of his world was rough cotton, cold ceramic, and the smooth, hard surface of the wooden floor. The temperature was often stifling in summer, bone-chilling in winter, no relief from the elements. As Samuel grew from infant to child, his deformities became more pronounced, his movements more jerky and uncontrolled. He never learned to speak, communicating instead through guttural sounds and the desperate, pleading movements of his twisted limbs. He was a prisoner in his own body, and a prisoner in that small, dark room. The only solace, if it could be called that, was the wall. With what, no one knew for certain, perhaps a loose nail, a shard of pottery, or even his own fingernails, Samuel began to make marks. Hundreds of them. Thin, irregular scratches in the plaster. A desperate attempt to record the passage of time, to leave some trace of his existence. They were not organized, not a calendar, but a chaotic tapestry of lines, each one a silent scream against the oblivion that was his life. There were also crude drawings etched into the plaster with what might have been a piece of charcoal or a stone. They depicted a figure, unmistakably human, but with limbs bent at impossible angles. A distorted reflection of his own body. These were not the joyful scribbles of a child exploring his world, but the desperate self-portrait of a being trying to comprehend his own fractured form, to make sense of his own existence in a world that denied it. Thomas Rich visited his hidden son occasionally, perhaps once a month, perhaps less. These were not visits of paternal affection, but inspections. He would stand in the doorway, his face devoid of emotion, observing the child with a detached, almost clinical gaze. He would inquire about Samuel's health, his needs, but never with tenderness. The visits were brief, functional. A man checking on a broken piece of machinery he had decided to keep rather than discard. Margaret, consumed by her own fragile health and the crushing weight of the secret, rarely entered the room. The other children, William, Catherine, and James, were vaguely aware of a sick child kept in the back, a hushed secret that permeated the very air of the house. But they were never allowed to see him. Never allowed to speak of him. The silence surrounding Samuel was absolute, a suffocating blanket woven from fear and shame. The slow, agonizing passage of time for Samuel was marked only by the changing light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded window, the subtle shifts in temperature, and the growing number of scratches on the wall. He was a ghost in his own home. A living testament to a father's chilling pragmatism and a society's unforgiving judgment. The year 1895, when Henry Vance made his unsettling discovery, was a time of profound change in Georgia. The scars of the Civil War, which had ended 3 decades earlier, were still visible on the landscape and in the hearts of its people. The old plantation economy had crumbled, replaced by a patchwork of tenant farming and nascent industrialization. The grand houses, once symbols of wealth and power, now often stood in various states of disrepair, their paint peeling, their timbers groaning under the weight of memory and neglect. Henry Vance, a man whose life had been shaped by the meticulous order of ledgers and archives, found himself increasingly consumed by the anomaly of Samuel Rich. His initial professional curiosity had deepened into a quiet obsession. The discrepancy was too stark, too deliberate, to be dismissed as a mere error. He spent his evenings poring over old maps of Muskogee County, cross-referencing names, searching for any mention of a Samuel Rich in local newspapers or church bulletins. The more he searched, the more the absence of Samuel Rich from any other record became a deafening silence. The archival setting itself seemed to amplify the mystery. The vast, echoing halls lined with shelves of forgotten lives felt like a mausoleum of untold stories. The dry, papery smell. The faint rustle of turning pages. The distant clatter of a typewriter from another office. These were the only companions to Vance's growing conviction that he had stumbled upon something profoundly unsettling. He imagined the census taker, Josiah Crane, sitting on the veranda of Willow Creek, the humid Georgia air heavy around him, quill scratching, unknowingly inscribing a lie into the official history of the state. The thought sent a shiver down Vance's spine, despite the summer heat. His initial attempts to find a logical explanation proved fruitless. He checked death registries for Muskogee County for any Samuel Rich born around 1848 who might have died before 1860. Nothing. He looked for records of families named Rich moving out of the county. None matched. He even considered the possibility of a child being sent away to an asylum or institution, but such places were rare in Georgia in the 1850s, and their records, where they existed, were equally silent on a Samuel Rich. The more he investigated, the more the conclusion solidified. This was not an accident. This was deliberate. The realization was a slow, creeping dread. Someone, a person of influence and means, had intentionally falsified a government document. But for what purpose? The answer, Vance suspected, lay not in a simple desire to evade taxes or hide a minor transgression, but in something far more personal, far more desperate. The phantom Samuel Rich was a symptom of a deeper, darker secret, a carefully constructed illusion designed to protect something precious or conceal something shameful. Vance knew, with a certainty that transcended mere professional duty, that he had to go to Muskogee County. He had to speak to the Rich family, or what remained of it. The truth, he felt, was waiting there, buried beneath decades of silence and red Georgia clay. The journey from Atlanta to Muskogee County in the autumn of 1895 was a slow, rattling affair by train. The landscape outside the window was a tapestry of change and decay. The cotton fields, once vast and meticulously tended, now showed signs of neglect, interspersed with patches of scrub pine and fallow land. The grand plantations, many of them, were either crumbling ruins or had been broken up into smaller farms worked by tenant farmers or sharecroppers. The air, crisp with the approach of winter, carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Vance arrived in Muskogee County with a sense of trepidation. He was a man of paper and ink, not of confrontation, but the mystery of Samuel Rich had taken root in his mind, demanding resolution. He carried with him copies of the census documents. The stark contrast between the 1855 and 1860 entries, a silent accusation. His first stop was the county courthouse, where he hoped to find more local records, perhaps a will or a property transfer that might shed light on the Rich family's affairs. He found little that was new, but the courthouse clerk, an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, remembered the Riches. Thomas Rich, he mused, a stern man, kept to himself mostly after the war. His son William runs the place now, what's left of it? Armed with directions, Vance hired a buggy and driver to take him to Willow Creek. The road, once a well-maintained thoroughfare, was now rutted and overgrown. The journey was slow and bumpy. The plantation house, when it finally emerged from behind a stand of ancient oaks, was a shadow of its former grandeur. The paint was peeling. The veranda sagged. The once manicured lawns were now a tangle of weeds and wild grasses. The air around the house felt heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken histories. William Rich, now in his early 50s, received Vance on the decaying veranda. He was a man whose shoulders seemed permanently bowed, his face etched with the weariness of decades of struggle. The war had stripped him of his inheritance, his labor force, the very foundation of his world. He offered Vance a glass of lukewarm water, his hospitality a thin veneer over a deep-seated resignation. The parlor where they sat was faded and dusty. The once vibrant wallpaper now peeled in strips. The heavy velvet curtains were moth-eaten. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the creak of the old house settling. Vance, choosing his words carefully, explained his purpose. He laid out the census documents, pointing to the entry for Samuel Rich in 1855, then to its absence in 1860. He spoke of discrepancies, of the need for accuracy in the state's records, of his professional duty. He did not accuse. He merely inquired. "Mr. Rich," Vance began, his voice soft but persistent, "can you shed any light on this anomaly? Was there a clerical error? Did the boy perhaps die or move away, unrecorded?" William Rich's reaction was immediate and visceral. His already pale face drained of all color. His eyes, previously dull with fatigue, now held a flicker of something akin to panic. He stared at the documents, then at Vance, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, its rhythmic beat a stark counterpoint to the sudden tension in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, controlled rumble, but beneath it, Vance detected a tremor of suppressed emotion, anger, shame, fear, all carefully contained. "That is a matter, sir, that does not concern you," William said, his gaze unwavering. "It is a family matter, and it has been closed for 40 years. It is not your place to inquire into it." Vance pressed gently, explaining that as a state official, he was merely seeking to clarify the historical record. He meant no offense, only accuracy. "Mr. Rich, the state archives strive for completeness. This discrepancy, if left unexplained, leaves a gap in our understanding of this county's history." William Rich rose from his chair, signaling the end of the conversation. "My father," he stated, his voice gaining a brittle edge, "was a man of principle. He kept his affairs in order. If there is a discrepancy in the census, it is not the fault of my family. It is the fault of the census taker, or of the clerks who have since handled the documents. I will not discuss this matter further." He turned to leave the room, his back stiff with unspoken defiance. But as Vance began to gather his papers, William Rich paused at the doorway. The anger seemed to drain from him, replaced by a profound weariness, a look of almost desperate resignation. He turned back, his eyes meeting Vance's, and in that gaze, Vance saw a lifetime of burden. "There was a child," William said, his voice barely a whisper, the words seeming to tear themselves from his throat. "A child born to my mother in 1855. The child was not well. My father made a decision about how the child would be recorded. That is all I will say. The matter is closed, and it has been closed for 40 years. I would ask that you leave it closed." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Vance alone in the dusty parlor, the silence now heavy with the weight of a half-confession. Vance asked what had happened to the child, but William Rich simply shook his head, his shoulders slumped, and disappeared down the hall. The conversation was over. Vance left Willow Creek with more questions than answers, but he had gained something crucial, confirmation. The phantom child was real. He had been born. And his existence had been so profoundly unacceptable, so shameful, that the family had conspired to hide him from the world. The question now was not if Samuel Rich existed, but what had happened to him, and why his father had chosen such an elaborate deception. Over the next several months, Vance embarked on a painstaking investigation, a quiet, methodical pursuit of truth in a community that preferred its secrets undisturbed. He understood that direct questions would yield little. Instead, he adopted a more circuitous approach, engaging in seemingly casual conversations with the oldest residents of Muskogee County, people whose memories stretched back to the antebellum era. He frequented the general store, the church, the local tavern, listening to snippets of gossip, piecing together fragments of information like a mosaic artist. He spoke with elderly formerly enslaved people who had worked on the rich plantation, now living in small, scattered communities, their voices soft with age and the weight of their own histories. One such woman was Hattie, now well into her 80s, her skin like parchment, her eyes clouded with cataracts, but her mind surprisingly sharp. Vance found her living in a small cabin on the outskirts of the county, her days spent tending a meager garden. He approached her with deference, speaking not of census records but of the old days at Willow Creek, of Mrs. Rich, of the children. Hattie, after much gentle prodding and the sharing of a cup of sweet tea, finally spoke of the child. Her voice was a low, raspy whisper, as if the words themselves were painful to utter. She confirmed that Margaret Rich had given birth to a boy in 1855, a child who was not right. She described his twisted limbs, his inability to speak, his constant soft whimpering. He was a child of sorrow, she murmured, her gaze distant. Master Thomas, he couldn't abide it. Said it was a curse. Said he wouldn't have no such thing in his house, not for the world to see. She spoke of the child being kept in a back room, of her and Clara being tasked with his care. She spoke of the silence that surrounded him, the unspoken rules, the fear of Master Thomas's temper. She did not explicitly describe the deformities, but her tone conveyed a profound sense of pity and horror. Vance also sought out Joseph Caldwell, a man in his late 70s who had been a neighboring planter in the 1850s. Caldwell, a garrulous man with a booming laugh, remembered Thomas Rich well. Thomas was a proud man, Mr. Vance, Caldwell declared, puffing on his pipe. Obsessed with appearances. Everything had to be just so. His crops, his family, his reputation. The idea of anything less than perfection. Well, it would have driven him to distraction. Caldwell recalled whispers, vague rumors of a sickly child at Willow Creek, but nothing concrete. Thomas kept his secrets close. Tighter than a drum. His testimony painted a picture of a man so consumed by social standing that he would go to extreme lengths to protect it. The most unsettling confirmation came from Reverend Elijah Stone, now a frail elderly man living in retirement in a small parsonage. Vance found him sitting by a window, reading his Bible, his hands trembling slightly. When Vance delicately broached the subject of a secret baptism at Willow Creek in 1855, Reverend Stone's eyes, though dim with age, widened slightly. He hesitated, his gaze falling upon the worn pages of his Bible. "A man's confidences," he began, his voice raspy, "are sacred, Mr. Vance. Especially those given in the shadow of God." But Vance, sensing the man's internal struggle, pressed gently, speaking of the importance of truth, of the historical record. Finally, Reverend Stone relented. He confirmed that Thomas Rich had indeed summoned him to Willow Creek in the spring of 1855, requesting a private baptism for an infant boy named Samuel. He was a difficult child, the Reverend admitted, his voice barely audible. Master Rich insisted on absolute discretion. Said the child was too frail for a public ceremony, that the Lord's mercy was best sought in private. The Reverend's discomfort was palpable, even after 40 years. He had performed the rite, offered a prayer for the child's soul, and had never spoken of it again, not even to his wife. He had been troubled by the request, by the secrecy, but had felt powerless to refuse the powerful Thomas Rich. Vance also encountered false leads and misdirection. Some old-timers suggested that Samuel might have been sent to a distant relative in another state, a common practice for families with children deemed unmanageable or unfortunate. Others whispered that the child had simply died in infancy, a common occurrence in those times, and that Thomas Rich, in his grief, had simply neglected to record the death. Vance meticulously followed each lead, checking records in neighboring counties, writing letters to distant institutions, only to find dead ends. Each false lead, however, only strengthened his conviction that the truth was far more deliberate, far more sinister. The child had not simply vanished. He had been made to vanish. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly, agonizingly coming together. A deformed child. A proud father. A secret baptism. A phantom entry in the census. A life lived in utter darkness. But the ultimate fate of Samuel Rich, the child of sorrow, remained shrouded in mystery. If you're finding yourself captivated by the unraveling of this historical enigma, and you appreciate the meticulous research that goes into bringing these forgotten stories to light, please consider supporting the Liturgy of Fear. Hit the like button, share this video, and let us know in the comments, do you believe Samuel Rich ever truly escaped his hidden prison? Your engagement helps us continue our journey into the shadows of the past. In the winter of 1896, more than a year after his initial discovery, Henry Vance returned to Muskogee County. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. His previous visits had yielded crucial testimony, but he lacked the definitive physical proof of Samuel's hidden existence. He had developed a theory, a chilling hypothesis. If the child had been hidden on the plantation, there must be some physical evidence. Some architectural alteration. Some trace of his confinement. He approached William Rich again, this time with a different strategy. Instead of directly questioning the census records, Vance presented himself as a state archivist conducting a historical survey of antebellum architecture, particularly interested in the unique construction methods of old plantation homes. He requested permission to examine the Willow Creek house, claiming it was a prime example of its kind. William Rich, though still wary, was less overtly hostile. The idea of his decaying family home being deemed historically significant seemed to appeal to a lingering sense of pride. After much persuasion and Vance's solemn promise not to disturb anything or make any public claims about what he found, William reluctantly agreed. The old house in the stark light of winter seemed even more desolate. The wind whistled through loose panes, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Vance moved through the rooms with a quiet intensity, his eyes scanning every detail, the thickness of the walls, the placement of windows, the flow of the layout. He paid particular attention to the back wing, the section Hattie had mentioned, the part of the house that felt coldest, most neglected. The air here was heavy, stagnant, carrying a faint, indefinable odor that hinted at long-standing disuse. It was in this back wing, tucked away behind the main kitchen and a rarely used pantry, that Vance found what he was looking for. There was a section of wall that seemed subtly out of place. The plaster was newer, a slightly different shade, and the texture was uneven, as if it had been hastily applied. It was too thick, too solid for a mere partition. He tapped it gently, and the sound was dull, unlike the hollow resonance of a typical wall. He noticed faint, almost imperceptible lines in the plaster, vertical and horizontal, suggesting a hidden seam. He turned to William Rich, who had been following him with a mixture of suspicion and weary curiosity. "Mr. Rich," Vance said, his voice low. "This section of wall, it seems to conceal an opening. A doorway, perhaps." William Rich's face, already pale, turned ashen. His eyes darted to the wall, then back to Vance, a flicker of raw fear in their depths. He stiffened, his jaw clenching. "That room is not to be opened," William stated, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "My father sealed it, and I have kept it sealed. What happened there is not your concern, nor the state's." But Vance had seen enough. The room was real. It existed. And it had been deliberately hidden away, just as Samuel Rich had been hidden away. The physical evidence of the secret was before him. He explained, calmly but firmly, that as a state official investigating a historical anomaly, he had a duty to understand the full context. He appealed to William's sense of family honor, suggesting that only by revealing the truth could the past truly be laid to rest. After a tense, protracted silence, William Rich, his shoulders slumped in defeat, finally nodded. A single, silent tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. With William's reluctant permission, Vance carefully began to remove the plaster. The work was slow, painstaking, each chip of plaster revealing more of the hidden truth. Beneath the plaster, he found thick wooden planks nailed securely across what had once been a doorway. The nails were old, rusted, driven deep into the frame. A deliberate, forceful act of concealment. As the last plank was pried away, revealing the dark, gaping maw of the doorway, a wave of stale, heavy air, thick with the scent of decay and long, stagnant confinement, washed over them. Vance stepped into the room, holding aloft a lantern. The light, weak and flickering, struggled against the oppressive gloom. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, its single narrow window still boarded up from the inside, allowing only slivers of weak light to penetrate the perpetual twilight. The air was cold, damp, and utterly still. What he found inside was heartbreaking in its simplicity and its profound desolation. A narrow cot, its mattress rotted and stained, stood against one wall. A rusted chamber pot lay overturned in a corner. A small, rough-hewn table, its surface scarred and warped, held the remnants of an ancient, melted candle. But it was the walls that truly captured Vance's attention. They were covered, from floor to ceiling, with marks. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of thin, irregular scratches etched into the plaster with what must have been a desperate, relentless effort. They were not organized, not a calendar, but a chaotic, desperate testament to the passage of time. A silent scream against the oblivion of confinement. And amidst the scratches, crude but unmistakable, were drawings. Figures. Human-like, but distorted, their limbs bent at impossible angles, their heads disproportionately large. They were the kind of drawings a severely disabled child might make, trying to understand his own body, trying to make sense of his own existence in a world that had denied it. They were self-portraits of suffering, rendered in the dark by a hand that could barely hold a tool. William Rich stood in the doorway, his face ashen, his eyes fixed on the marks on the wall. He said nothing. His silence was a profound testament to the horror he had lived with for so long. When Vance finally turned to him, his voice hushed, and asked, "What happened to Samuel, Mr. Rich?" William simply shook his head, a single, guttural sound escaping his lips, and turned away, unable to articulate the full, crushing weight of the truth. The sealed room, the physical evidence of Samuel Rich's existence, was a silent, eloquent witness to a life lived and lost in darkness. It took several more visits, several more hushed conversations, and the slow, painful erosion of William Rich's defenses before Henry Vance was able to piece together the full, tragic story of Samuel Rich. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more terrible than Vance had imagined, a testament to human cruelty born of fear and pride. Samuel Rich had indeed been born in the spring of 1855 to Margaret Rich. The child had been born with severe physical deformities. His limbs were twisted, his body contorted, and he was unable to speak or move with any degree of independence. The exact cause was never determined, but they were profound enough that Thomas Rich, upon seeing his son for the first time, made an immediate and chilling decision: the child would not be acknowledged as his own. There had been whispers, Vance learned from Hattie and Clara, that Samuel's deformities were so severe, so unlike a healthy child, that some on the plantation speculated he was not Thomas Rich's child at all. Perhaps the result of a hidden liaison. Or even a curse. This speculation, whether true or not, would have only fueled Thomas Rich's desperate need for concealment. A child born to an enslaved woman, particularly one with such profound deformities, would have been a scandal of immense proportions, exposing Thomas Rich's hypocrisy and potentially leading to legal complications regarding the child's status. But even if Samuel was Margaret's biological son, his visible imperfection was a stain Thomas Rich could not tolerate. Either way, the child's existence was a problem Thomas Rich could not abide. So Thomas Rich created the phantom child in the census records, a way of acknowledging that a child named Samuel existed without acknowledging that the real, deformed child hidden in the back room was his son. The phantom Samuel aged in the records, a ghost in the machine of bureaucracy, while the real Samuel remained frozen in time, hidden away, cared for by enslaved women bound by fear and circumstance to keep the secret. For 5 years, Samuel lived in that small, dark room. He was fed. He was given water. He was kept alive. But he was never taken outside. Never allowed to see sunlight except through the cracks in the boarded window. Never spoken to. Never touched with affection. Never acknowledged as a person. He was a problem that Thomas Rich had solved by making him disappear, and the solution had worked perfectly. The marks on the wall, William finally admitted, were indeed Samuel's desperate attempts to mark the passage of time, a silent testament to his agonizing confinement. Then came 1860. The census again. Thomas Rich faced a choice: continue the deception, aging the phantom Samuel year after year, or let the phantom child disappear from the records. He chose to let him disappear. The phantom Samuel Rich vanished from the 1860 census, and the real Samuel Rich became truly invisible, not even a phantom in the documents, but a complete absence. But what happened to the real Samuel after 1860? That was the question Vance could not definitively answer, though he had his suspicions. According to Hattie and Clara, the child had died sometime in the early 1860s, probably around 1862 or 1863. The cause of death was not recorded, but the women suggested that Samuel had simply wasted away. His body, already twisted and broken, had simply given up. The constant confinement, the lack of stimulation, the sheer neglect of his emotional and physical needs, all had taken their toll. His death was not recorded in any official capacity. There was no funeral. No grave marker. No acknowledgement. The body was buried somewhere on the plantation in an unmarked grave, a final act of erasure. And the secret was kept. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the plantation was in chaos. Enslaved people were leaving. The economy was collapsing. The old order was crumbling. In the midst of this upheaval, the room where Samuel had been kept was sealed up, the door nailed shut, the wall plastered over. It was as if Thomas Rich, in his final years, had decided that the evidence of his crime, for it was a crime, though no law had been broken, should be erased from the world. The sealed room became a tomb for a memory. A physical manifestation of the family's collective guilt. The story of Samuel Rich, the child who appeared in records before he was born, is a chilling testament to the power of secrets and the lengths to which individuals will go to preserve appearances. It is a narrative woven from fear, shame, and a profound, almost unimaginable cruelty. As Vance compiled his findings, he began to understand something that went beyond the simple facts of Samuel's life and death. He began to understand the insidious psychology of secrecy, the way a lie, once told, becomes a burden that grows heavier with each passing year, poisoning everything it touches. The phantom Samuel Rich had existed in the census records for 5 years, a ghost child who aged in the documents while the real child remained hidden. And for 40 years after that, the secret had been kept, passed down through the family, a weight that each generation had to carry. William Rich, Thomas Rich's eldest son, had grown up knowing that his youngest brother existed but did not exist. That there was a child in the house who was not supposed to be there, not supposed to be acknowledged, not supposed to matter. This knowledge had shaped William's entire life. It had made him complicit in his father's crime, even though he had been a child himself when Samuel was hidden away. It had given him a secret he could never share, a shame he could never escape. His bowed shoulders, his weary eyes, his profound resignation. All symptoms of this lifelong burden. When Vance asked William why he had kept the room sealed after his father's death, why he had not destroyed the evidence, or at least opened the room to air it out, William's answer was revealing, delivered in a voice heavy with decades of unspoken grief. Because, William said, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy horizon, as long as the room was sealed, I could pretend that it had never happened. As long as no one knew, the shame could be contained. The moment I opened that door, the moment I let the world see what my father had done, the moment I acknowledged that my brother had existed and had suffered, I would have to accept my own complicity. I would have to accept that I had known, and had done nothing. This was the true horror of Samuel Rich's story, Vance realized. It was not just the physical suffering of a child hidden away in a dark room. It was the psychological suffering of an entire family, bound together by a secret, unable to speak of it, unable to acknowledge it, unable to move past it. It was the way a single act of cruelty could ripple through generations, poisoning everything it touched, leaving behind a legacy of guilt and unspoken sorrow. Vance began to wonder, how many other Samuels are there? How many other hidden children? How many other families made the same choice that Thomas Rich made? How many children had been hidden away, erased from the records, made to disappear? How many families had carried the weight of such secrets, their lives warped by the need to maintain a facade of perfection? The thought was chilling, suggesting a hidden history of suffering and denial beneath the seemingly placid surface of the past. By the spring of 1897, Vance had gathered all the information he could find. He had interviewed everyone still alive and willing to talk. He had examined every available document. He had explored the plantation house and found the sealed room where Samuel had been kept. He had pieced together a narrative that, while not complete, was coherent and compelling. A tapestry woven from whispers, half-truths, and the stark evidence of the sealed room. He prepared a report for the state archives, detailing his findings and conclusions. The report was careful, measured. It presented the facts without sensationalism. It did not accuse Thomas Rich of any crime. There was no crime, legally speaking, in keeping a child hidden on one's own property. It did not condemn the family. They were products of their time, operating within a system that valued appearance over truth, respectability over compassion. But the report did raise profound questions. It suggested that census records were not always reliable, that they could be manipulated, that they did not always reflect the truth of what was happening in a community. It suggested that there were hidden stories in the archives, stories deliberately obscured, stories that required careful investigation to uncover. The report was filed away in the state archives, where it remained largely unnoticed for many years. Most people who read it dismissed it as the obsession of a clerk with too much time on his hands. Some people in Muskogee County were offended, seeing it as an attack on the Rich family and on the county's honor. The Rich family itself made no public response, though William Rich reportedly said in private that Vance had no right to dig up the past. But Vance had accomplished something important. He had brought Samuel Rich back into existence. The child who had been erased from the records, who had been hidden away and forgotten, was now documented, now acknowledged, now part of the historical record. The phantom child who had appeared in the census before he was born had been explained, and in being explained, had been given a kind of dignity he had never possessed in life. The legacy of Samuel Rich, the child who existed only in shadows and on a single anomalous census record, lingered in Muskogee County like a persistent, unsettling echo. In the years following Vance's investigation, the story began to circulate, passed along in hushed whispers and fragmented rumors, growing and changing with each retelling. Some people, unable to reconcile the cruelty of the truth, invented more palatable fictions. They said Samuel had not died, but had been sent away to an institution in the north, where he had lived out his life in obscurity. Others, seeking a more dramatic resolution, claimed he had been killed, that Thomas Rich, in a fit of despair, had smothered him in his sleep to end his suffering. Still others, particularly among the younger generation, spoke of Samuel's ghost haunting the old plantation, claiming to hear strange whimpers from the sealed room or seeing the marks on the walls appear and disappear mysteriously. None of these stories were true, or at least, there was no evidence to support them. But they spoke to a profound human need, the desire to make sense of tragedy, to find meaning in suffering, to transform a private shame into a public narrative that could be understood and discussed, even if imperfectly. The community, in its own way, was grappling with the unsettling truth that had been unearthed. William Rich lived for another 10 years after Vance's investigation, dying in 1907 at the age of 62. He never married, never had children, and spent his final years in increasing isolation. According to neighbors, he became obsessed with the sealed room, checking on it frequently, making sure it remained sealed, as if its continued concealment was the last desperate act of loyalty to his father's twisted legacy. When he died, his will specified that the plantation house should be preserved exactly as it was, with the sealed room left untouched. a silent monument to a forgotten sorrow. The will was honored for several decades, but eventually the house fell into such disrepair that it became unsafe. The sealed room, the physical evidence of Samuel Rich's existence, was eventually lost to time and weather, its contents crumbling into dust, its walls collapsing. The plantation itself changed hands several times in the decades following the Civil War. By the 1920s, it had been subdivided and sold off in pieces. The main house was finally torn down in the 1950s, its timbers salvaged, its bricks repurposed. The land was developed into farmland and small residential properties, erasing the last physical traces of Willow Creek and its dark secret. The sealed room, the silent witness to Samuel Rich's life, was destroyed, leaving only Vance's report and the fading memories of those who had seen it. But the story of Samuel Rich did not die. It lived on in the archives, in the census records, in the memories of people who had known the family or had heard the story passed down through generations. It became a kind of local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrets, about the price of respectability, about the way shame can poison a family for generations. It became a whisper in the wind, a shadow in the history of Muskogee County. What makes the story of Samuel Rich particularly unsettling is not just the tragedy of his individual life, but what it reveals about the nature of official records and the way history is constructed. The census, that most basic and seemingly objective of documents, had been manipulated to serve the purposes of a men who wanted to hide the truth. And because the census was an official document, because it carried the weight of government authority, the lie had been accepted as truth for 40 years. This raises a disturbing question. How many other lies are embedded in the historical record? How many other children, other people, other stories have been erased or falsified in the documents we rely on to understand the past? The census records are supposed to be a complete and accurate count of the population, but they are only as accurate as the people who fill them out. And if those people have reasons to lie, shame, fear, ambition, cruelty, then the records become something else entirely. They become a kind of official fiction. A narrative constructed by the powerful to serve their own purposes. Vance's investigation had uncovered one such fiction, but he had also raised the possibility that there might be others. In his report, he suggested that researchers should carefully examine census records for anomalies, children who appeared and then disappeared, ages that did not match between censuses, names that changed or vanished. He suggested that these anomalies might not be clerical errors, but deliberate falsifications, evidence of secrets hidden in plain sight within the official documents. Some historians took Vance's suggestions seriously and began to look for similar patterns in other census records. A few found them. Cases of children who appeared in one census and disappeared in the next. Families whose composition changed in ways that could not be easily explained. Records that seemed to have been deliberately altered or falsified. In some cases, researchers were able to uncover the stories behind the anomalies. In other cases, the truth remained hidden, buried too deep in time and distance to be recovered. The story of Samuel Rich became a kind of template for understanding these hidden stories, a way of thinking about what might have happened when official records did not match reality. It became a reminder that history is not always what the documents say it is. That truth can be hidden in plain sight. And that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, can eventually be uncovered by someone patient enough and curious enough to look for them. But there is one aspect of Samuel Rich's story that remains unresolved, a mystery Vance was never able to solve, and that has puzzled historians ever since. The question is simple, but its implications are profound. Why did Thomas Rich create the phantom child in the census records in the first place? If Thomas Rich wanted to hide Samuel's existence, the most straightforward approach would have been to simply not list him in the census at all. The census taker, Josiah Crane, was a distant relative. Thomas could easily have instructed him to ignore the child, to pretend he did not exist. No one would have questioned it. Children died. Children were born. Families moved away. The absence of a name from the census would have raised no eyebrows. But instead, Thomas Rich created a phantom child, a false Samuel who aged in the records while the real Samuel remained hidden. Why? What was the purpose of this elaborate deception? One possibility: Thomas Rich wanted to create a record of Samuel's existence without revealing the truth about him. By listing a phantom Samuel in the census, he was acknowledging, in a way, that a child named Samuel existed. But by making the phantom Samuel 5 years older than the real Samuel, he was creating a barrier between the two, a way of saying they were different people, that the phantom Samuel was not the same as the hidden child in the back room. Another possibility: Thomas Rich was trying to protect himself legally. If Samuel had been born to an enslaved woman, then the child would have been enslaved. But if Thomas Rich could claim that Samuel was born in 1848, before the child's actual birth, then he could argue that Samuel was not his child at all, but the child of someone else who had since left the plantation or died. The phantom Samuel in the census could have been a kind of legal shield, a way of deflecting responsibility for the real child. Or perhaps the explanation is even simpler. Perhaps Thomas Rich was simply trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy, to create a record that suggested everything was fine, that the family was intact and functioning as it should. The phantom Samuel was a way of saying, "Yes, I have a son named Samuel, and he is healthy and normal, and nothing is wrong." The lie was not meant to hide the truth so much as to reinforce the fiction that Thomas Rich had created for himself and for the world. Whatever the reason, the phantom Samuel remained in the census records for 5 years, a ghost child who had never existed, who aged in the documents while the real child remained hidden. And when Thomas Rich finally removed the phantom Samuel from the records in 1860, he created a mystery that would not be solved for another 35 years, until a curious clerk named Henry Vance decided to investigate a discrepancy in the census records and uncovered a story that had been carefully hidden away. The story of Samuel Rich is, in many ways, a story about the power of records and the way official documents shape our understanding of the past. It is a story about how truth can be hidden in plain sight, how lies can be embedded in the very documents we rely on to understand history, and how a single act of cruelty can ripple through generations, affecting not just the victim but everyone connected to him. But it is also a story about the power of curiosity and persistence. Henry Vance, a clerk with no special authority or expertise, was able to uncover a secret that had been carefully hidden for 40 years, simply by noticing something that did not fit. By asking questions. By following the trail of evidence wherever it led. His investigation did not change the past. Samuel Rich was still dead. The family was still broken. The shame was still there. But it did bring the truth into the light, and in doing so, it gave Samuel Rich a kind of dignity he had never possessed in life. The story of Samuel Rich also raises questions about the nature of disability and the way society has historically treated people with severe disabilities. In the 1850s, there was no support system for families with disabled children. No institutions dedicated to their care. No social acceptance of disability as a normal part of human variation. A child like Samuel, born with severe deformities, was seen as a tragedy, a shame, a problem to be hidden away. Thomas Rich's response, to hide his son and pretend he did not exist, was cruel, but it was not unusual. Many families made similar choices, hiding disabled children away, denying their existence, treating them as if they were not human. The story of Samuel Rich is a reminder of how far we have come in our understanding of disability and human dignity. But it is also a reminder of how much work remains to be done. Even today, in the 21st century, people with severe disabilities face discrimination, prejudice, and social exclusion. The story of Samuel Rich shows us what happens when that prejudice is taken to its extreme, when a child is denied not just acceptance, but existence itself. As we reach the end of this story, there are still questions that remain unanswered. Mysteries that the historical record cannot fully resolve. What was the exact nature of Samuel's deformities? Was he born to Margaret Rich or to an enslaved woman? Did he die in the early 1860s, or did he somehow survive and escape? Where was he buried? Is there a grave somewhere on the old plantation, an unmarked resting place that no one has ever found? These questions may never be answered. The people who knew the truth are long dead. The plantation house has been torn down. The sealed room has been destroyed. The only evidence that remains is Henry Vance's report, filed away in the state archives, and the census records themselves. The phantom Samuel Rich, appearing in 1855, disappearing in 1860. A ghost child who had never existed, but who had left a trace in the official documents. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the fact that we know Samuel Rich existed, that we know his story, that we know what happened to him, is enough to give him a kind of immortality. He was hidden in life. Erased from the world. Denied existence by his own father. But in death, through the work of a curious clerk and the accident of document reorganization, he has been brought back into the light. His story has been told. His existence has been acknowledged. And his suffering has been witnessed. The phantom child who appeared in the records before he was born has finally been given a name, a story, and a place in history. And perhaps that is the only justice that can be offered to a child who was denied justice in life. The discovery of Samuel Rich's story in the census records reminds us that history is not always what the documents say it is. It reminds us that truth can be hidden in plain sight, that official records can be manipulated, and that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, can eventually be uncovered by someone patient enough and curious enough to look for them. It also reminds us of the importance of asking questions, of noticing when something does not fit, of following the trail of evidence wherever it leads. Henry Vance was not a detective, not a historian, not someone with any special authority to investigate private family matters. He was simply a clerk who noticed something odd in the census records and decided to investigate. And in doing so, he uncovered a story that had been hidden for 40 years. The Rich family's secret is now part of the historical record. The phantom child who appeared in the census before he was born has been explained, and in being explained, has been given a kind of dignity he never possessed in life. The sealed room where Samuel was hidden has been documented. And the marks on the walls, those hundreds of scratches that might have been an attempt to count the days, have been witnessed and recorded. But the story of Samuel Rich is not just a historical curiosity. It is a story about the price of secrets. About the way shame can poison a family for generations. About the cruelty that can hide behind the mask of respectability. It is a story that challenges us to think about what we hide, what we deny, what we are willing to erase in order to maintain the appearance of normalcy. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets hidden in the archives? Still mysteries waiting to be uncovered? Leave your comment below and tell me what you think happened to Samuel Rich. Whether you believe he died on the plantation, or whether you think he somehow escaped and lived out his life in obscurity. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, stories of mysteries hidden in plain sight, of secrets buried in the historical record, of truths carefully hidden away, subscribe to the Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell. And share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries and historical enigmas. See you in the next video.